Our next speaker is Dr. Tal Seidel-Malkinson. She received a PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she is now a postdoc researcher at the Paris Brain Institute, specialized in the neuroscience of attention and visual perception. But she also took on a leading role in a study on gender imbalance. Sorry, I will put the first slide. On gender imbalance in editorial processes of scientific publishing. And she's going to show us that representation does not necessarily translate to inclusion. So thank you, Tal.
So thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm not an expert in the field, and it's just a hobby. So I will tell you my experience and what I think from the user point of view, and from a scientist point of view, who wants to understand better the work environment that we are all work at. So let's start with that. If you ask your children to draw a picture of a scientist doing science, what would they draw? Would they draw a man scientist, or would they draw a woman scientist? And actually, this is not just a fun afternoon activity to do with your kids. This is an experimental task used by scientists to study the association children make between science and gender. And when we look at many such studies that use the task, so like here, each dot is one study, and we look at the performance, what boys draw and what girls draw, we see that most of the children draw men scientists, and this is true from 1965 when they started collecting this type of data, and it's, this tendency weakens with time, but especially with girls. So children make this association between scientists and men. And why do they do that? It is not because they are born with a knowledge that science is for men, but as we saw here in the first two talks of this session, they just learn things from the environment, because our brains are wonderful and sophisticated statistical learning machines, and children assimilate the statistics from the environment that they hear in the media, as we saw now, what they read in textbooks, and what they hear in the adult conversations that show them much more examples of scientist men than scientist women. And so, unfortunately, what they see in the media and what they hear around themselves reflects the sad reality in scientific careers. And what we see here is the leaky pipeline that we already heard about today for women in science research. And if we look at the representation of women here in blue and of men along the stages of scientific careers, we see that if women start at around 50% or a little bit more in the beginning of their career as students, as they transition to be independent researchers, their representation drops. Perhaps, I don't know if you should call it, if they drop out or if they are pushed out, and they reach a representation of less than 30%. So why does this happen? So probably it's a very complex situation with many factors contributing, with a lot of small effects that accumulate over women's career and make this pipeline leaky. However, I want to concentrate on one factor here, and this is scientific publishing. So scientific publishing is a focal point, it's a major focal point of research and science in general. So let me illustrate using this quite realistic depiction of the process. So if a scientist discovers something, it's not just sufficient to say, hello, I discovered something. It has to be evaluated and disseminated to the community to count. So they write up a paper and then submit it to a journal and go through a very pleasant process of peer evaluation that evaluates the content and rigorousness of the paper, and then at the end either the article is published or not. And this is very important for scientists and for science, and we commonly call it the publish or perish, because if you want to stay in academia and in science, you have to publish, otherwise you don't stay. And this is because for scientists, the number of publications and the prestige of the journals in which the articles appear is one of the most common metrics for scientific excellence. So it influences hiring decisions, prizes decisions, if you are invited to conferences, etc. The other side of it is the participation in all this process. So all these nice guys here, being selected or nominated to have an editorial role is a mark of esteem. It is an opportunity for networking and for influencing science. However, it is also very important for science itself. It provides for major purposes. It provides registration, who discovered what first, certification, so if the study is reliable and valid. It is a way for disseminating the data and the findings with the scientific community and society, and it also preserves the data and the knowledge for posterity. So let's look more in detail at the scientific publishing process. So as we said, the scientist makes a discovery, it drafts an article, then sends it to the highest journal he could think of that would maybe have a chance to publish there. And then at the triage phase, the editor of the journal evaluates the potential of the paper and the fit to the scope of the journal. And if it goes through there, then this peer review process starts. There are reviewers, other scientists that evaluate together with the editor the reliability, the validity of the claims and the interest of it. And they give their comments. The paper is revised, and then after going several times through this cycle, the editor has to decide if to publish or not, and hopefully at the end your paper will be published. If not, you'll just have to start all over again in another journal. So this is an objective evaluation supposed to be based on facts. However, as it turns out, as you heard today, scientists are also humans, and they are also prone to all kinds of biases. And so this scientific publication process is not always impartial. And there are a lot of examples and documentations that there is skewed representation of women in publishing. So for example, the representation, women are underrepresented as senior authors on articles, so they're less often the lead author on published articles. They are also underrepresented in editorial boards of journals, and they are much less invited to be reviewers and participate in the evaluation of articles in this process. So what I want to do now is take you behind the scenes of an example of this editorial process and show you how the interaction between editors are affected by gender in one journal, eLife, which is non-profit, open access journal led by researchers that covers all the domains in biology and medicine. And I have to say that eLife were very, very brave and transparent in sharing their data with me and my colleagues here. And they allowed us to ask this question of the influence of gender in the decision-making during this editorial process. So let's zoom in now on this editorial interactions in eLife that has a very particular structure in this journal. So in eLife, when a paper arrives to the journal, it reaches a senior editor, that then invites several reviewing editors, so they are like a lower level in the hierarchy, for a consultation. And they discuss together the potential of the paper and decide in the triage phase if this article is potentially fit for eLife. If it goes through the triage, then the senior editor assigns one reviewing editor to handle the peer review process. And this editor will invite the reviewers and consult with them on the content of the paper, if it's valid, if it's reliable, if it's novel enough, etc., etc. And so we wanted to ask if these interactions are influenced by the gender of the reviewing editor first. And the first step that we took is to look at the potential. What is the bank, the pool of the reviewers, and how is it affected by gender? So in eLife, like in many other journals, the representation of women is smaller than the representation of men in the board of reviewing editors and in the board of senior editors. And eLife was made aware of that, and because they're active and they want to do better, then they try to improve it and recruit more women. However, this happened in 2019, so our data set is between 2017 and 2019, and we wanted to, when we wanted at the beginning to also afterwards analyze the influence of this gradual recruitment of more women to this editorial board. We had a small problem here that a small confound entered here in the form of COVID pandemic that kind of made it impossible to measure what happened after the addition of women. So we're only looking here on data until 2019. So women are underrepresented in the board of editors, and we will use this underrepresentation as a baseline. And now we want to ask the question, how are interactions between the editors affected by the gender beyond the numerical representation of women and men in the editorial board? So the first stage that we concentrated on, we focused on, is the triage phase, where senior editors invite several reviewing editors for a consultation. And this consultation is done online in a kind of a chat forum, where people write back and forth to each other. So we asked how these interactions affected by the gender of the reviewing editors. And there's something important to say here, that we define the gender here not on self-definitions, so it's an approximation. It's based on the name and pictures of the editors, and we did not include other intersecting identities. So this is just a very simplified version of the story. What did we find? We found that women reviewing editors were as invited as men by senior editors to participate in this discussion. However, they responded a little bit less, by 3%. So men editors responded 91% of the requests, and women responded to 88% of the requests. And women responded slightly later, by 7 hours. So these seem like very small effect, but when you think about the format of this consultation, that it is online and everybody just says what they think, then men reviewing editors provide their opinion first and set the tone. It's like an anchoring effect that they contribute more to the decision, perhaps. So there could be a lot of reasons why men and women have a difference in the response rate. We did not have a lot of data about it. We have some indications that when eLife wanted to increase their representation, they started adding more women editors that are slightly more junior, for example. So maybe they have more obligations in other domains to get tenure or for families or whatever. So there might be other confounding factors that contribute here. In the next stage of the assignment of reviewing editors to handle the peer review, we looked at how many of the reviewing editors that the senior editors assign are women compared to men. And we find the women reviewing editors handle 9% less manuscripts than the men. And It's important to say that this stage of the editorial process is one that is very, it gives a lot of advantages to the reviewer, to the editor, because it is a community-facing job. It provides opportunities for networking and for scientific influence, and women miss on this part of the job. And so now we wanted to take a deeper look into this interaction, and we wanted to add the factor of the gender of the senior editors to it. And we found something that resembles a bit what Rawan showed, that there is a same gender preference here, homophily. So if we look here at how women senior editors assign manuscripts to women reviewing editors and to men reviewing editors, we can compare their preferences, how much they assign to this yellow line, which is the manuscript assignment without taking the gender of the senior editor into account. And we see that women senior editors assign more manuscript to women reviewing editors, because the red surface is to the right of the line, then to what we would expect by not taking into account their gender. We find similar results with men, and men tend to assign more manuscript to men reviewing editors than what we would expect based only on, without taking into account the senior editor's gender. And this is replicable even when we look at separate domains within the expertise of eLife. It's true with neuroscience and cancer biology, developmental biology, ecology, computational neuroscience, many different domains. And basically it shows us that women's editorial participation is lower than their actual representation. So what is this homophily? What are we talking about? So homophily is a fundamental human tendency. We prefer to interact with similar others, and this is true from a young age, as we saw before. It is true in school, it is true in our workplace, and it turns out it's also true in academia. And it's not that innocent, because it is also associated with cognitive shortcuts. For example, cloning. We favorably evaluate someone with similar attributes to our own, or we tend to make snap judgments, making decisions based on isolated factors such as they went to the same university, for example, rather than on the evidence as a whole. And there is evidence that homophily shapes scientific interactions in a variety of contexts, like in conferences, or who we collaborate with, or even who we nominate and select to get a Nobel Prize. And as I said, even these small effects are accumulated and trickle down along women's career. So it has impact on scientists. For example, we found that senior editors tend to assign same-gender reviewing editors for the peer review. But in other studies, it was shown that editors tend to appoint same-gender reviewers. So we have more men editors assigned that assign more men reviewers. And then it was also shown that all men reviewing teams tend to accept more men-led manuscripts. So now we have a real measurable effect, not only in the participation in the editorial process, but also on the consequences on scientists' careers. It also has impact on science as a whole, because homophilic groups tend to have similar mindsets, so they are less creative, they are less critical, and in total, the uncontrolled effects of homophily may undermine the impartiality of peer review and thus undermine science. So how to do better? On the individual level, we can do this. The ABC of doing better in this respect is act intentionally, be aware, and check yourself. But on the organizational level, and this is, eLife was very keen to hear about our ideas on how to improve their system. First of all, to increase representation, have more women on board, and in this case, the editorial board. But this is not enough, as we showed, and it's not about how many are there, but how are they included and how they can participate in the process. So we need to increase inclusion. And we can do that by adapting the system, making nudges and little tweaks that can help people be aware, act intentionally, and check themselves. For example, in the triage phase, we can make decision time not a limiting factor and reveal feedback after all editors had an opportunity to engage, and like this, minimize the effect of first come, first served. And we can include more women in the triage to account for their lower response rate. In the peer review assignment phase, we can give feedback on gender imbalance patterns to senior editors and make them aware of their history of decisions. And, of course, we should increase transparency and awareness to the risks of homophily in science. So that's it. I want to thank you, and of course thank my amazing collaborators in this study, Tamar Macon, Maria Guerrero, Devin Terhun, Dani Bassett, and Matthew Kolam-Kula, and eLife, of course, that were very brave and transparent here in sharing this data, and are really a torchbearer in how to make scientific publishing better. Thank you.